So we'll go ahead and get started. And I apologize for the formality of using a microphone, but they said we need to use the microphones because they're recording. So we have a few more folks coming on in. Thanks so much for joining us. As I said, we're a small group, so we'll have a lot of chance for discussion and hearing what some of you are working on. Come on in, we're fine. I am your moderator today. I'm Ora Kanagas. I direct the Office of Public Policy and Advocacy for the American Friends Service Committee, and I bring the bad news that at least one and possibly two of our speakers had visa issues. So we still will have wonderful presentations today, but as we are in many contexts, we're experiencing some of the barriers to being together and hearing each other's voices that are kind of cooked into our current political situation globally. So you can say more about Kenya. Yeah. So let me say a little bit about shared security as a general concept to start us off. Back in 2012, a colleague and I were trying to think through. We felt like we were in an interesting political moment, and it's just gotten more interesting since then. And Quakers historically have been part of many long arc change strategies, abolition of slavery, civil rights movement. And in all of those contexts, there was a very clear end goal that was what we were headed toward. And in our work for a more just and peaceful world, we started to realize we kind of knew what that might look like in our heads, but articulating what that state is was we felt part of the challenge for seizing a narrative about what builds well-being. So peace is a concept that means so many things to different people, and for many is inherently sort of over-optimistic or Pollyanna-ish. You know, you're just going to hold hands and everyone's going to be peaceful. We understand that peace is a much more sophisticated concept of that, and we wanted to articulate what a world would look like with a different set of relationships and foreign policy approaches to move beyond kind of an us versus them view of the world, a zero-sum game view of the world. And we gathered a group of people with very different backgrounds to think through how you could articulate such a concept. And what emerged from that was the idea of shared security. Shared security as essentially a synonym for shared well-being, and thinking through the ways that on a resource-constrained planet and in an infinitely interconnected world, it's not possible to build a true well-being that's based on suppression or oppression of another group. And the myth that has pervaded security regimes in this era has really been a very different view that says, for my security and well-being, I probably have to undermine your human rights. Sorry about that, but it's for my security. And I think really calling out that myth of security regimes to say that cannot create sustainable well-being. Sustainable well-being has to include a role for shared well-being, shared security. So we articulated out this concept, and then we, as our international program staff kind of worked with that framing, they thought through some different contexts where that shift from a zero-sum game approach was particularly pressing in their contexts. And elections were an area where we saw again and again kind of this winner-takes-all, us versus them mentality, creating incredible drivers of violence and oppression. And so electoral violence became one of the areas of focus for our shared security work. We have two great folks with us today who are going to talk about a report that has been done to build out the concept of shared security in election contexts, and who do a range of amazing work on the ground in their own right. So Kennedy Eccolo is a development practitioner with over 20 years of experience working in the development sector in Africa. Kennedy is the current regional director of Africa for the American Friends Service Committee, which, as I said, is a Quaker organization that works to promote lasting peace with justice, both globally and in the U.S. Globally, including in the U.S. Based in Nairobi, Kenya, is where he works. Prior to joining AFSC, Kennedy worked in a parliamentary context, a parliamentary strengthening program where he supported efforts to strengthen inclusive legislative processes in 5 East African countries. He's worked for several other international development agencies focused on education, governance, and peace, and has a real passion for strengthening social cohesion amongst post-conflict communities, which has also been based on his personal experiences. In his current role, Kennedy is implementing innovative approaches to peace building in Africa through a new framework of shared security, based on that simple understanding that shared problems require shared solutions. His educational background includes an MSc in Organizational Development from USIU Africa and a BA in Economics from Kenyatta University in Nairobi. During his free time, he enjoys family time, visiting the few remaining tropical rainforests, and occasionally a little bit of Rumba dancing. We'll take that as a challenge. And then Dr. Pauline Kamau is also with us today. We're grateful to have her. She is currently working as a Quaker International Affairs representative in Africa for the AFSC. Her role is specifically on advocacy for peace in Africa, linking the grassroots information with national governments and regional bodies in Africa, for basically learning and implementation of peace policies. She works specifically with the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority and Development, East African Community, among other bodies. She's a doctorate degree holder in Gender and Development from Kenyatta University, in Diplomacy and International Studies at the University of Nairobi. She received her MA, and she has a bachelor's degree in Education in Business and Economics. So basically anything you need, you can go to Pauline. She's been a lecturer for a number of universities in Kenya, specializing in gender and development studies, conflict management and resolution. And she's a livelihood expert with vast knowledge in enterprise development, especially in pastoral areas in Kenya and East Africa. Her specialization is on gender, conflict management, and peace building, strategic planning, and she's worked in prevention of violence against women, women's economic empowerment, and supporting women's political engagement, which is a good segue to some of the things we'll be talking about today. And so I will turn things over to Kennedy, and he will present a bit, and Pauline will present a bit, and then we'd like to engage you in conversation about what you're working on and what you are seeing in your various contexts.
Thank you, Ora. Good morning, everybody. We're using the mic, I think Ora said it, because it's being recorded, so we've got to use it despite the small group. So I don't know whether to stand. Yeah, maybe if I stand, it would be better. Yeah, my name is Kennedy Eccolo, and as Ora said, I work for American Friends Service Committee as the regional director for AFSC based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I've been working in that region for quite some time. And before I start also, I want to thank Alliance for Peace for availing this opportunity for us to be able to share with you the study that we recently carried out, and maybe to look at areas, what we found out, but also to look at areas that might need further interaction with as we go out there. So thanks so much for availing yourselves also so that we can go through this together. So as Ora said, this was based on our shared security framework, And what I always say is that shared security is based on the Ubuntu philosophy espoused by Bishop Desmond Tutu, which says you are because I am, and I am because you are. So shared problems, shared solutions. And that's where we get our framework for shared security. Globally, we looked at the different themes, but for us in Africa, based on the work that we've been doing in the region, we decided to settle on the issue of electoral violence because we were seeing a lot of that happening. And we realized that there were so many issues that brought about this violence, And I think we'll go into those details maybe further to look at it based on the study and the findings. But our work basically in the region has focused mostly on working with youth specifically and trying to nurture youth leadership, considering that Africa as a region is an area that we have a burgeoning youth population. It's almost over 60% in most contexts, in most countries. So talking about a big youthful population. But this population, again, because of, inclusive issues, they're excluded from the mainstream in so many cases, there are lots of struggles and so many things that are happening that sometimes we are tempted. And I see a lot of people, pointing a very negative finger sometimes towards the youth. So that's why we focus on this. The other thing that we've been working on is issues around social cohesion on the continent, trauma healing, and reintegration of populations, back into their societies, mostly in post-conflict situations. And then finally, the other thing that we are focusing on, which brings in also the study that we're just going to talk about, is actually trying to carry out continuous conflict analysis and to ensure that we are in tandem with the issues and the dynamics of conflict in the region. Conflicts can be very context-specific also. So that's a bit of a background what we are doing at the moment. But based on that interaction with the communities, based on that interaction with at policy level, one of the issues that we decided to focus slightly more on is on prevention of electoral violence. So we undertook this study. And some of the findings are the findings that you already know because there's research already out there. There's a lot of literature that has been done around electoral violence. But one of the areas that we realized from the study, which again Pauline will talk about, is the fact that we did not have a lot of literature specifically on what has worked and what has not worked. What are some of the preventative measures that have been put in place and have worked in some places that can be shared in others for replication. So those are some of the areas that which we try to focus on. But I have to appreciate that still there's so much that needs to be done. And this was a very limited study in so many ways. So again, I'll take us through this. I'm hoping that we can have, because this is a very small group, we can have a bit of interaction to see what has worked elsewhere, to be able to share. And then I think it's actually trying to create those opportunities for us to continue networking and see how best we are going to try and address the issues of electoral violence. I also want to mention the electoral issues in Africa is what triggers a lot of the challenges that we are having in the region. So when we talk about migration, I think we've all seen those boats that try to cross through the Mediterranean with people, who, crammed together and, you've seen what has been happening, all the body counts that have been coming in, a few who have been saved and all that. A lot of it is also triggered by the issues to do with governance as a result of electoral issues. So I think it's a very important and critical area for us to try and focus on to try and resolve so many of the issues that afflict the continent of Africa. So I'll go a little bit through the slides and I'll try to explain a few things, but we'll have a session later on where you can ask questions and then we can interact together. So these were basically the main objectives of the study that we're thinking about. As I said, we wanted to look at the literature on prevention and then try to look at the causes and consequences of the violence, and also trying to look at policy solutions. When Aura introduced Pauline, she said Pauline has been interacting with some of the regional instruments, including the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the SADC, Southern African Development, and all that. But also just to mention that as an organization also, we are not in the entire continent. we focus on 4 specific countries at the moment. So we are not everywhere. We will not be able to talk about everything around the continent. So this experience is based on where we work, and there's a comparative analysis of some of the countries that I'll show you. So why the study, and I've said a little bit about that again. We were concerned about the causes of electoral violence and looking at opportunities for us to explore a bit on issues of prevention. But also, we've just seen that there's a lot that has captured the attention of both practitioners, donors, and then everybody else, on the issues of violence around elections on the continent. And then we thought that it's also an opportunity for us to be able to look at at good practices elsewhere that we could share with, like-minded organizations and other practitioners that we can try and see opportunities for replication. And then, as I said again, it was a study, but it had a lot of limitations. So it's good that we are aware about that as we ask maybe some of the questions. So there was time factor, and then the cost, I said we did it as AFSC alone, so we don't have that huge budget. We had very limited funds to do this, but we tried to do what we could do. And then the interviews, which focused on key informants, were conducted mostly around capital cities. So it was conducted in 4 countries. That's in Kenya, Malawi, Sierra Leone, and Sri Lanka, which is in Asia, for comparative analysis. But also, there's something, I've put that in italics, Bujumbura, which is in Burundi, because that's not yet complete. However, we thought that it would be good. If you look at these countries, most of them are Anglophone countries. So we took Bujumbura, which is a Francophone country. We wanted to have a bit of, comparative, whether the issues are the same in Anglophone, situations and Francophone situations. Given that a lot of the challenges, again, we face and the structures that were put in place by 2 different systems. There's the British colonial system, and then there was the French colonial system, which was slightly different from the British. So that's why we did that. So the report from Bujumbura, which is in Burundi, that is not yet out. We'll have it as an annex to the report. We'll give you a few copies, and then we'll give you where you can direct anybody else, online to access the report itself on soft. Then also individuals that were interviewed. This is another limitation again. Were mostly at a very high level. A lot of them were connected to community, but given that we focus mostly, as I said, in capital cities, so a lot of the interviews that the consultants carried out, a lot of the people we spoke to were actually based around the cities. But there was that connection between many of the practitioners whom we interviewed, with a very local level. So there was a bit of a limitation around that. And then there are also specific areas maybe that we didn't delve so deep into it, so a lot of it you'll see maybe what comes out. We didn't look at maybe the role of the private sector, and all other sectors, specifically in what they could do in preventing electoral violence, or what they could do to support, peace processes at times of elections. So those were some of the limitations, not all. I said 4 countries, Burundi ongoing, I've already mentioned. So you saw those capital cities, Kenya, Malawi, Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, and Burundi ongoing. So those are the 4 countries that we did. Then the 5th one will be availing the annex, which I think you'll only be able to get it online once it's complete. But again, in Burundi, we face a few challenges there. For those of you who are familiar with the country, you've heard about the decision of the government to suspend the operations of all international NGOs. So at the moment, again, the study, whatever, we are doing it very slowly. It might not move as fast as we'd hoped we would. So I'll just look at my final slide maybe to talk about here before I hand over to the able hands of Pauline, is to look at definitions again. We appreciate that there are various and different definitions of electoral violence, but we just wanted to highlight that this is the definition that the study and the report is based on. So this is the definition as advanced by Batch and Machlinsky in 2017, which says that election violence is understood as a coercive force directed towards electoral actors and/or objects that occur in the context of electoral competition, and it can occur before, it can occur during, and it can occur after elections. And it can target a variety of actors such as candidates, activists, poll workers, election observers, journalists, voters. And Pauline will talk about other issues in relation to the gender perspectives in relation to the violence. So that is the definition that we are going to use for the purpose of this study. And I'll hand over to Pauline to take us through the rest of the slides.
Thank you, Kennedy. Let me see which hand I use most. Yeah, I'll stand here. So I'll continue with. Oh, sorry.
No, just don't worry about the. You're fine.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll move on to the next slides, and I'll be actually now talking about what the backgrounds we found and the real on the ground findings that we had, and also some of the best practices in prevention of electoral violence, and what areas that we feel that we need to delve deeper in. So from our research finding, we found out that actually electoral violence is a common feature globally. We cannot say there is one continent that does not really experience some form of electoral violence. But and we also found that there is so much emphasis on the media about electoral violence in Africa. But from our study, Southeast Asia and South Asia are actually more prone to violence than, Africa. However, the severity, probably that is why the issue of Africa comes, the severity in Africa is much higher than those other countries. And of course, just like we have been discussing in this conference about the youth. And yesterday I also sat in one meeting where they were saying that let us not define the youth as in a certain age, but according to how we can, use them in peace building. And we found that they are more prone to manipulation by a section of political class to cause actually violence. And we know if we have over 65% of the young population and they are being manipulated, they are unemployed. That is one of the things that we face. There is unemployment. So when they see $5 or something like that being given to them to cause violence, they are bound to go because they say we have got nothing to lose. So that is what we found out. And also we found out that there was inadequate research on strategies for prevention. Yes, there is a lot of literature about electoral violence, but what are the strategies? What can we do to prevent electoral violence? And of course, the other thing is that many programs concentrate on prevention at community level, but there was a disconnect between community and the policy level. So you find so much work at the community and a little bit at the policy level, but there is that disconnect. So we were trying to see how can there be synergy between what is being doing on the ground and the policy level. The person who was doing the research was actually Charles Taylor, not the one of Liberia. They found out that most electoral violence in Africa is perpetrated by incumbent governments.
Pauline, can you speak more?
Sorry,
in the mic
incumbent governments. Sorry, incumbent governments and their supporters, including where the incumbent knows they are going to win. And we had an example of Liberia, where Charles Taylor was the president. He knew he was going to win, but he still had to perpetrate violence. And we can look at so many countries where we have incumbent governments which are strong, but yet they perpetrate violence. Then, of course, we also found out that supporters are likely to perpetrate, opposition supporters, the government and opposition supporters are likely to perpetrate violence in post-election period. That is after they have seen the results. they generally will not accept that, and there will be violence. Then still on, we also saw that electoral violence occurs where political systems are based on patronage and clientelism. And then what are we saying here is that those formal institutions, electoral monitoring bodies, they are superseded by some informal relationships. That is, you have a relationship with, so-and-so, then, that one, as an institution, it doesn't really matter. So you saw that there are, political loyalty. Who has been put as the chair of Electoral Commission? Is it, through political loyalty or something like that? So that's what we found out. And we also found out that political supporters will perpetrate violence in support of their preferred candidates. We have seen it in all those countries that we did the research. This was actually very common. And this, I've already talked about it, the severity of electoral violence differs. Because if you look at some places in Africa, it has been so bad. Then we also found that the balkanization of ethnic groups by politicians. This is one of, especially in Africa, and also in Sri Lanka, we also saw that you find that some of the politicians are willing to use their ethnic group, us versus them. You are my people. The others are, trying to, not to support me, or they don't want me to be the leader. So you see that they have really balkanized the issue of ethnicity instead of using it to, build the country. Then the other thing is that we also found that where there has been a longer history of social conflict between ethnic groups, there is bound to be conflict. That is where different ethnic groups have been in conflict. When it comes to election, they find a reason of, violence. And we saw that actually election is not necessarily, violent, but because there's those people who want to use certain, conflict that has been there, they become an excuse. Elections become an excuse to violence. Then, of course, weakness of electoral management bodies, I cannot re-emphasize this. We have seen it, Kenya, Zimbabwe, even in Sri Lanka, even in Sierra Leone, where we carried out the research. When we have weak electoral management bodies, there's going to be conflict because people will complain and they will do nothing. Then, of course, the presence of social conflict or unresolved historical issues. We've seen them in Kenya, we've seen them in Zimbabwe, and we have seen them even in Burundi. They are historical. And unless they are resolved, we will not really be seeing, we'll still be seeing conflict, and especially the issue of land. Land is an emotive, issue in Africa. And when it comes to election, that is when now people start agitating for, their land rights and other historical issues. Then, of course, this was very interesting. The presence of international monitoring observers may reduce or increase violence. And we found out that when they come into, like we have, sorry to use Carter Center, we have others coming in. When people see them, they start seeing, there's not, at least it will be credible. And of course, the incumbent government would want to be seen to be nice and, we don't want to cause violence. But the minute they leave and they say that this election probably was a fraud, violence occurs. And mostly when they leave. Then the other thing is that men and women experience, I don't even need to re-emphasize this. Men and women experience electoral violence differently. But even if we know that, there are still very few policies that are addressing that. So what do we need to do? Then, of course, we also saw that in countries like Sri Lanka, Kenya, Burundi, and even Zimbabwe, disproportionate use of violence by government security forces. And in all the places we did research is that we found that the police force especially, they do not, even if they are trained, they do not know how to, to deal with a mob or to deal with demonstrations. They actually will use tear gas or whatever they have. So we found that that was a major concern, and most of the deaths, they were actually caused, in all those countries, they have been caused by the police forces. So the best practices. Yeah. And prevention of electoral violence is successful when part of this, we saw that this could be some of the things that we may use to prevent electoral violence. And this is implemented where there are strong coalitions and consortia. We saw that in Sierra Leone and Sri Lanka, where we have got strong coalitions coming together and saying no to violence. It's almost like a movement of people saying, we don't want to have this. So whether it's sustainable, that is something we would need to delve deeper into. And of course, the other thing is where there is involvement of political parties and candidates in electoral prevention violence programs. We do not involve political parties. I'm saying that as we, as a peace builders, most of the times we leave them out, and even the candidates themselves. And we need to more and more involve them, because places where they have tried to involve them, there has been reduced violence. And then the practitioners are exposed to successful programs that have borne, positive results elsewhere. If we take best practices from one country, probably we can come and, use it in a different context and see, can this work? Because we saw in Sierra Leone, they used that and it worked. And even Sri Lanka. Then also, where the long-term peace-building strategies are adopted, we found out that these long-term peace-building strategies are not there. And when it comes to donor funding, they actually put in money 6 months to elections, and immediately after elections, they go. So we do not cultivate that culture of peace building. So we need to start looking at long-term strategies that we can adopt to build peace, so that it is a continuous process of peace building, whether there are elections or not, or whatever happens. Like now, probably we are waiting for, Burundi, we are waiting for 2020. We know there's going to be violence. What are we doing about it? You look at countries, Somalia, I think they are going to elections next year. What are we doing about it as peace builders? Kenya, 2022, what are we doing? And I can go on and on and on. Are we doing anything, or we want to go there just before elections? Then, of course, where there is collaboration with the private sector may help to reduce violence. And there was a good example of Kenya private sector, where they joined together and said no to violence, and in certain areas there was actually, where they were strong, there was no violence. But with a caution that private sector may also be partisan. They may be supporting either the incumbent or the opposition, so you may not know. Then, of course, the role of donors. They should see elections not as an event, but as a process. So this is about the continuous funding on elections. Then we also thought that there are certain areas we need to delve deep into. Is the role of the private sector. Can we have more study in the role of the private sector in prevention of electoral violence? How can we use them, to be able to enhance that? And constitutional reforms, can they help decrease violence? That is another thing that we need to ask ourselves. We delve deep into that and we see what are the results. And of course, the role of increased use of election technology. And of course, this will be the media, so many, the social media and all that. And of course, even using, the fingerprints, that you go to a polling station and you are identified by either your prints or your face. And we found that in Zimbabwe, they used that system. Some people were going to the polling station, either your fingerprints are not there, your face is not there, then you are told you cannot vote. So is it differentiating people not to vote, or what is the role of technology? Then, of course, the role of religious and traditional leaders in decreasing violence. In many places, religious and traditional leaders, they can be used to prevent election violence. Can we do more research? Where has it worked? I know sometimes I remember in Kenya in 2007 when the religious leaders did not do anything, then later on coming up to say that we failed you. So what role? We don't have we didn't delve deep into that, but that is something that we need, to carry out. That is, you can reach us on that. But one thing I also need to know is that in electoral prevention and best practices can be done if we all use the power of collective action. That is the theme of this conference. So can we use that? It's not us. Can we all, join together? Collaborative work of us together can help us in prevention of electoral violence. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kamal. So I know we have a wealth of knowledge and expertise in this room, and I think we want to move for the rest of our time into a bit of a dialogue. I have questions, but I know many of you in the room may well have questions and also answers on some of these issues. So we will move into a discussion. Does anyone have a question to kick off?
Could you talk a little bit more about the role of donors in the, as you say, events versus process?
Thanks, Pauline. The role of donors, I think one of the challenges for donors, as Pauline put it, is that they come to fund preventive work just a few days to elections, So what happens is they'll hear that there'll be elections in Burundi, for instance. And then what happens is that we now need to mobilize some resources and try and put together some programs or interventions to try and ensure that the elections are peaceful. And then immediately after, they leave that country, So you've not really resolved the underlying issues, the underlying causes that trigger the conflict around elections. And so what we are saying is that donors need to be more responsible and look at it in a long-term perspective. And I'll give you another very good example. I had a meeting at the European Union in Brussels. And what happened, this is just an example, what happened when we had this meeting, this I was getting it directly from them. This was in relation to the Kenyan elections. For those who followed it, was that we had elections, then the court ruled that the elections were not were null and void, and so there was a presidential rerun. I think was it 60 days after? I can't remember the number of days. And what happened? What happened is that EU had programmed itself to support the peace process just until election time, and so the funds were depleted just around the elections time. And then they realized the tensions are rising in the country when the court had ruled that there's a presidential rerun. And now they didn't have funds, to support another, program to support continuous peace building. And what happened is that, of course, they identified some resources from somewhere, which I think they put through one of the UN bodies. But again, there were issues of accountability. How that money was used, it was a lot of money. I had the figures when I was there. I don't know whether there were any processes, whether there were any interventions put into place after that. But I think what we're trying to do and what the study was telling us is that we need to look at long-term funding in terms of prevention of electoral violence, but also understanding that there are so many underlying causes of the violence. I think Pauline talked about issues to do with land, issues to do with, historical injustices, all those transitional justice issues, we have to think about them and address them because sometimes electoral violence is just an indication of so many unresolved issues and underlying issues.
Mm-hmm. Please.
Lucy Steinitz from Catholic Relief Services. I'm from New York. I have a loud voice. Small group. I get the idea, and I think you're spot on, that if this is going to be addressed, it can't be you had $10 million or enough money that you needed, what would you do? I mean, what are the specific targets or activities or interventions that you understand will make a difference in combating this violence?
I can try to attempt that, then Kennedy will also add. And you can also give us ideas. But for us, from what we have seen, actually working with the youth, who are the most, the population that is used. And why are the youth used? Most of the time they are idle. And what we are not doing is creating, enough livelihood for the youth, to get them engaged. And youth as peace builders, because we need the youth to be leaders, to be peace builders. So that I would put my money there. Then, of course, trying to have the issue of women, putting money on women peace building, because they are the mothers of these young boys. And from what we have seen is that if you have women talking to, their husband, their children, you can be able to, to get some, peace building. So we need to go to the grassroots, up, down, and we need, to have those community-based peace building. How can we bring them up so that we can have people talking from top down, and also engagement of political leaders?
Can I just follow up?
Mm.
So do you, focusing on youth, yes, but is there evidence that the youth that commit for $5 or whatever acts of violence are in fact youth that are totally unemployed, or are they youth that have something, which is what any employment activity would end up giving, something but not great, and yet they're still frustrated and the $5 is still tempting? You follow what I'm saying? Yes. And the second question is, I'm not sure as a mother of a son how much influence mothers have of male children or any children, particularly over the age of 15, 18, 25. So much as I love focusing on women in general, it's not women who are the problem here or who have the influence, I think. It's young men. Am I right? So I'll push you both a little bit more, or others who might have, because we do youth programs, but
Do you want to speak to that? Or?
that's part of our struggle.
I think we have an audience member who might speak to that.
My name is Tom Crick. I'm with the Carter Center. But I'd like to talk more about peace building and prevention than international observation. I think your target for where to spend the money is right on the money, with the addition of community leadership, which would be traditional leadership. It would be the religious leaders that you were talking about. And in terms of how the youth can be influenced or engaged as peace builders, part of the challenge is youth feeling disconnected. And a common peace building agenda that involves women, that involves the leadership, is a way of giving youth not just a role as youth, but as a stake in community governance. And that can last longer than the elections if that sort of grassroots approach is taken. And we've got some very good success in that in Liberia, but that has been based on having worked since sort of 2006 consistently in communities, which in our lifetimes is very short, but in the lifetimes of a development project is almost infinitesimal. It's very hard to sustain activities and funding for 10, 15 years. So I think if you have a vision that is of good governance and violence prevention that goes beyond just the immediate elections, then the community can work together to create disincentives for the politicians to cause trouble in their communities, and create incentives for the politicians to be constructive. So.
Yeah, I think, Tom, you're spot on. Maybe just a quick response on the issue of influence on male children that you talked about. And I just wanted to give an example of a bit of what we've observed, because this could be very context-specific. One of the things that we see, especially in local communities in Africa, is that you find that the young people are the ones who go out. I'm just talking about leave alone electoral violence right now. But they're the ones who'd go out and do the fighting. And what happens is, when they come back home, the women would be singing songs, traditional songs, to praise them, for what they have just done, So really including mothers and women in these processes is very critical, because those songs are formed along those, trying to encourage them to continue being violent, So they'd go raid another village. When they come back, they're treated as heroes, and there's songs and dances, to praise those communities. So we have to really ensure that it is an integrated program that includes all. Yeah.
I have a question around, so as you talk about sustained work on election violence prevention, I mean, to me it seems that election violence is very much the symptom, not the cause. And if you're looking at situations where there are societal rifts and inequalities and a political process that feels like you're either in it or you're out of it, and it's kind of a winner-take-all situation, you have less to lose by spurring violence or participating in violence, and really everything is at stake in just winning. Is there a role for sort of long-term work to shift political processes and approaches to build some sort of sense of a loyalty to an effective system that serves across, no matter who is in leadership? Is that something that's been talked about or explored?
I'll give it a shot, then I'll give it to Pauline. Maybe I'll also say something about that. And I want to say electoral violence is both a symptom and can also be just violence on that day. Not because there were other issues, It's just violence on that day. And it is true that, the structures and systems that we have mostly in the African continent, which are around the winner takes it all, they are the ones that encourage, the issues of clientelism, the issues of ethnicity. It is about those, my people, the my people culture and the big man syndrome, These are the things that are perpetrating all these problems, And then it is true, like, those underlying issues, because they cannot addressed with that kind of system, because the structure is that it supports the winner and the, the winner and whoever else, was supporting them. And when you talk about structural violence, actually, that's a very good example of where there is structural violence, because if you are not part of the system, either you're with us or you're not with us. So it's us versus them, and I think that's what it perpetrates. But when I talk about the big man syndrome, the issue of institutions in Africa, when you talk about democratic other governance institutions, not just democratic institutions, that's a big problem, because everything depends on the big man, in quotes, sorry. It's not about institutions. It is about the president said this, the president said that, the president did this, the president was at this wedding. The president is the alpha and the omega. And so institutions don't function. And therefore, you end up with a system that is very skewed in favor of a very small ruling minority.
Yeah, I tend to agree on that. And looking at also the case in Sri Lanka also. From our research, we found out that what they did was that, the incumbent, when he got to power, he started also amassing all the wealth to himself, ignoring all the other institutions. And when you ignore all the institutions, is that people will no longer see that governance institution as something that can protect them. So what do? They resort to violence. They say that this is the only way we can make the leadership aware that we are not really happy because we cannot engage the way we are engaging, because if you demonstrate, you are met with that kind of force. So really, you see, because of those governance issues, you see that the only weapon they have is violence. And until in that example of Sri Lanka, when he started doing that, it was actually a people mass movement. And they agreed that this is enough is enough. He may be ours, but he's not doing enough, to ensure that we are all safe. And that is what took to remove the previous president in Sri Lanka. So some way we could also have mass movements of people saying, no, it doesn't matter whether you are from my tribe or something like that. What we care about is a system that is working, a system that can work for you and me, regardless of who is at the power. And that is what would really need to start educating people. It really doesn't matter who is at that level. It matters who can bring policies that can benefit the whole community. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Wango Muthoni. From the name, you can tell I'm from Kenya, where those people come from. But I'm a master's student from Kennesaw State University, Georgia, in conflict management and peacebuilding. So to kind of like piggyback on what my colleagues are saying, that, well, they're not my colleagues, my country people are saying about Kenya and what we've seen about during elections and all that. What happens a lot is during the election time and prior to that, there's a lot of, when you have these politicians who other times they are friends and buddies, but when it comes to the election time and each one of them wants to be the one to get the seat, they might even be in the same party during primaries, for example, and during that time, they would tear each other down and say all kinds of bad things about each other, like it has happened here too. We've seen it. And when they are doing this and they are talking all kinds of things and all that, okay, it's for the benefit of them getting there. But the youths who are down here and who have been carried away and have supported this candidate because of all what you said, now it gets to a point where now you have switched as candidates, and now you are in another position and you're vying for this. You leave the youth kind of like confused. Where are we? We killed each other. We fought each other in schools, in the streets, in the dormitories, if you're in campus and all that, for you. And now we no longer talk to each other, and we have already formed kind of like gangs or groups or what have you. Now you are out there. You're now telling us to switch roles and start supporting this on the other. It's kind of very confusing. When these youth get back to their homes, the mothers, for example, have very little they can influence because they've already been brainwashed. They've already been, it's not even necessarily the $5 or whatever that they are given, but these people have nothing, okay, yeah, they have things to do, but they are kind of like idle. So during this time, they have an activity. They go to sleep knowing tomorrow we wake up and we go and we scream on top of our voices, and we throw stones and we throw whatever we can, and we are fighting this group versus the other group. And then when all this is done, imagine how much momentum they have picked up during the elections time. Now the elections are over. This candidate has either won rightly or wrongly or corrupted or whatever, or rigged the elections or however. Now where do they go from there? What do they do with all that energy? They start becoming violent and in the streets and fighting each other in the areas where they live, in the slums or in the residential areas where they live and all that. So these problems that the youths are getting into, they are actually created, I I want to use the word created for lack of a better word, by the politicians who actually just wants to win the day for themselves. But once they get there, do they even remember who killed each other over them? No.
Yeah, there's something the lady had asked about the youth, and I've just remembered we didn't answer it, on whether, thank you, Wango, on whether it is about a youth who is not working, a youth who is not working, or somebody who is not even getting enough money. So, and I have just remembered some research which was done in some of the slum areas in Kenya, and some of the youth were saying that even if I am told to go, I will go. Because I do nothing, I just stay here. And what they get is not even, it's even less, $50. That is what they get, to go, out in the, to fight or to cause violence. But somebody who's got their 500, or let me say even $100, if you're earning $100, they say, why would I go out there for $50? I would, be working. So we have tried to look at the nexus between, livelihoods and peace, and you can see there is a close linkage of that. In some areas where there is a research that was done, I think Mercy Corps in Kenya, I don't want to talk about the one in Afghanistan, but they found out that there was actually the youth who were engaged in livelihood were much less likely to be used in violence. Yeah.
Hi, Elizabeth Wright from Conflict Dynamics International. Thank you very much. If I may, I might pose two questions. One, you mentioned the important role that sort of strong election management boards can play. And I wondered if you found cases where, like the Election Commission or other similar institutions, had not been so independent or transparent, but that had changed, and how that transformation occurred. And I'm assuming that that would be a positive transformation in reducing violence, but maybe that's incorrect assumption. And then the second question is on engaging political parties in the violence prevention programs. And did you find that the same approaches worked with parties in power and opposition parties, or were there different approaches that were effective?
Just a reminder again that we want this to be a discussion, so if others feel burning responses to that question.
I don't have a response to it. Do you want to answer that one first?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me take the second one. Let me try to answer. And about engaging political parties. Yes, from what we found out is that, there must also be willingness between the opposition and the political parties to come together. And we found out in Sierra Leone, they came together and they were able to address, the issues of violence. But you look at a place like, let me talk about, probably Kenya, and you could see there is really, they were not even agreeing. But when there was no, in 2013, or even 2002, you saw that the opposition and the government really, came together. So really, there must be, I cannot really talk of very good examples apart from Sierra Leone, because very few countries have had the opposition and the main government parties coming together. But if those two started talking together, I think we can really see, much less violence. Then the other one is the role of electoral management and other institutions.
Yeah, sorry, I can go to that because we didn't go into that really to look at where it's really changed. And I think those are the areas that we really need to focus on moving forward. I just wanted to add I just wanted to add on something that Wangu said around politicians, and again, taking Kenya as a very good case study, is if you look at the country just before before January, I think there was a lot of tensions in the country throughout. And then around February the 9th, the opposition leader and the president shook hands in public, and it just killed that tension almost instantly. If you come in the country, you don't see that tension. So really, political parties and politicians, we need to engage them in these processes, you know. It's very, very important.
Hi, great panel. So my name is Beverly Thompson, and my organization is Cultures of Peace. I've been involved in community engagement. I made some notes for myself. Grassroots reconciliation systems in Zimbabwe. I've been studying since 2010. And so I find this an interesting conversation, and I'm hoping that at some point you guys will include Zimbabwe in your study, although you know much about it already. But I think that they are a great case, especially as you look at kind of the recent events that have occurred. So the research that I had done and the writing that I had done on my thesis was basically looking at the post-2008 conflict that occurred after the elections, looking at it from the perspective of youth participation in what happened in the violence after the election, what happened to women, the gender-based violence that actually occurred against women who were wives of MDC leaders, and what was the role of the religious voices at the time. So a couple of things that I think related to some of the questions that you asked. One of the things that I found was that the mobilization of citizens were very important and has been important, and you've seen that in the current election cycle that has occurred. Citizens, I think, felt more empowered in Zimbabwe than they ever have before, understanding that it still comes at a particular risk. And so having more programs that will help in the mobilization of citizens, helping citizens understanding what their rights are, not just during election time, but period. What are your rights? What's in your constitution? You know, what should my government be doing for me? And what can I do about it? Now, there are cases where that's not easy. And in Zim, that's definitely an issue. But I did find more participation with citizens now that I have ever seen before. And I'm really impressed by that. Especially in Zim's case, because they had laws on the books for so long that just prevented groups from meeting. You couldn't even meet together. And so if you met in public, you could get in trouble. So understanding what the laws are. And it's interesting in this perspective because groups were out during this election cycle and they were meeting, but the laws still have not changed. So at any point, they still could enforce those laws. So the second thing was participation of youth that you guys talked about. And teaching youth also about their rights, I think, is an important one. So even if you focus on youth advocacy in whatever forms that may be, when I did my research, I talked to several youth who have been involved and coerced into committing violence after 2008. And it is what you say is true. The economic issues were a big one for them. They were coerced because they had no money. And so they did a lot of things based on their own survival and other reasons, of course. But that is a big one. And so when you're in a country like Zim where there's such an economic hardship, what do you expect to happen? And so I think that when NGOs can be more active in the country, which is still a challenge, to be able to focus on youth programs for generating income, I think is like one of the biggest things that we need to focus on. The other is ongoing efforts for trauma healing. If you look at the historical perpetration of violence against citizens in that country, I would say that that country as a whole suffers from PTSD. And so if more programs can be done to help citizens on a regular basis deal with the violence that, and I'm not talking about from a government level, but from a community level. If there are more efforts that allow people to get together and talk about what happened to them and reconcile with their neighbors, I think would be an important one. Another discussion I think you mentioned was about the focus of traditional leaders, which I think is very key as well. I agree with that, especially when you look at Zim, where traditional leaders played an important role with actually what happened in their communities. They were the gatekeepers. So if they allowed others to come in and coerce their institutions, you know, they were the gatekeepers. And one of the things that I have found is that if you could target them and help them understand that it's my job to take care of the people who I am over, and to really kind of empower them, I think is an important thing. So, sorry for the long.
That's great.
Get out of the panel.
That's great. And let the panelists respond to some of that, and then I think Tom had a hand also.
Okay, I'll go. First of all, thanks so much for bringing in Zim. And Zim is one of the countries where we have a program in, so we have really been in touch with the situation down there. And I totally agree with everything that you've talked about. You know, there's so many historical issues that Zim needs to deal with. There's a lot of trauma issues that Zim needs to deal with. What was perpetrated in parts of Zimbabwe, in Mashonaland, that has never been, you know, like dealt with. I think that still poses a great challenge to peace efforts. The Zim youth population is big. Zim is struggling economically. For those of you who don't know, Zim does not even have its own currency. It uses right now they use about 4 currencies. There's the US dollar, there's the Botswana pula, and then the South African rand, and then the bond note. So you have to combine. So you can you pay in dollars and you get your change in pulas. You can't even tell what was transacted. So there's so many challenges that face the country. I completely concur with you. The only thing that maybe I can pose to the audience is the issue of the diminishing space for civil society organizations to be able to operate in such circumstances. And again, I want to introduce the role of some of the narrative that is coming from the US. Previously, the US had a role, you know, globally. But right now, what is the US projecting to the rest of the world? It's almost trying to reinforce those negativities, and the world is paining. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, how else can I conclude rather than what you have said, because they watch the US. And you hear that the US said this, so why would we, you know, also not, you know, do the same? But the issues in Zimbabwe, we are hoping they could also be solved, because like now they have a TRC?
It's called the
National
Reconciliation Commission.
Yes, so they have instituted that, so we are hoping that once the report is out there, they'll be able to implement. We know mostly the countries invest so much on that, but when it comes now to implementation is a problem. And the case is in place is Kenya also. You know, there was a good report which, if it is implemented to the letter, most of the violence we see would end, because it addresses some of those issues that we saw. So really, we are yet to see it, you know, being implemented. We hope it will be implemented, because it might be, you know, it might address some of those issues that we are talking about. Yes, I completely agree with you. Traditional leaders, I cannot even, you know, overemphasize that. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on your comment about how to link community level actions to the policy level and that gap. I mean, you've identified many of the sort of the higher level factors, the political leadership, what kind of rhetoric and tone they have, the organization of the Elections Commission. Can add to that how the security forces comport themselves. There's certain activities that can and regularly do take place to try to address those in terms of technical assistance, in terms of codes of conduct, in terms of some real, some staged public acts of commitment to peaceful processes. I think one thing that's and the thing that links those together is common information about how the process should run. So people in the communities know what should be happening, and their leaders know that the communities know. And so, what are the mechanisms for doing that? And sort of radio and debate and widespread messaging, I think does have the best chance to have an impact. And if it can be constructed in a way that the politicians have difficulty in blocking it or you're questioning its assumptions, rather than these being political messages, these are messages of, well, this is what the law says, and if you behave in this way, you're with the law, and if you behave that way, you're against the law. And so that can help set up, again, disincentives throughout the process.
I want to just pick up on what you said about looking to the U.S., and I think there has been a paradigm similar to the one that you pointed out in your presentation that says, that sort of highlights African election violence, even where it may be Asia where it's more widespread. And in the U.S., there has been a paradigm of electoral issues and violence being something out there. And I think as someone... there have always been concerns with voter disenfranchisement and suppression and structural violence that has been baked into the system, but it's being surfaced in particularly widespread ways with incursions on the Voting Rights Act and protections being rolled back. So the U.S. is now very visibly impacted by many of the issues that we see with elections. So do you have some advice for us in the U.S. As we look to an election cycle that feels very scary?
Yes, my first advice is stop sending to your leaders parcels with explosives. So
we'll make a note of that. Yes.
To be honest, I think you introduced a very good angle in this discussion. And I just wanted to say that I think for a long time, I think despite there's so many challenges that face the U.S. and the world, there was a perception at some point that the U.S. was the upholder of those democratic principles and values, but that's no longer there. I think right now, if you look at what's going on in the U.S., I think it's reinforcing dictatorial tendencies in so many of the African countries. And it's terrible, it's horrible. It's almost like that moral, well, I don't want to say the U.S. is moral, but that moral leadership, or rather that example of...
The idea of a moral
that used to function at some point right now. If you look at, and I look at one of the countries that we work in, which is Burundi, right now, when was it? Last month in September, when the government decided to suspend the operations of all INGOs, international NGOs. Mm-hmm. The voice of the U.S. is not there, absolutely not there. And really the government doesn't care really whether the U.S. says anything or it doesn't say anything. Previously, maybe if they said something, maybe the government would have listened. And for me, that sometimes also worries me to a certain extent. I know the country needs to get its act in order. Mm-hmm. But the implications, because if you look at the reasons why the government suspended INGOs, there were three things, and they said that INGOs needed to comply with the local laws. And amongst the local laws that were saying that INGOs needed to comply with included one, there was a requirement that all INGOs, open accounts with the central bank so that all the monies flow through their central bank. Number two, there was a requirement that 60% of the staff employed by INGOs should come from the Hutu tribe, and 40%, so there's a ratio, 40% come from the Tutsi tribe. If some of you can remember, in 1994, there was a genocide in Rwanda, and that genocide was based along those tribal lines because the constitution of the Burundi ethnicity is exactly the same as in Rwanda. It's the Hutus and Tutsis. And so when the government comes out and says that now INGOs have to give us, the names of, and the numbers of, the Hutus employed and the Tutsis employed, what does that mean? Are we starting to look at some sort of genocidal, trajections coming into place, We need to be very careful, but we can't hear the voice of the US right now in things like those. Of course, there were the complicities, especially to do with the US in 1994 during the genocide in Rwanda. I think who was president then? Was it Clinton or somebody? Yeah, it was Bill Clinton, but I've not heard, well, we are not expecting anyway to hear anything from the US given the rhetoric from the US. There's not much expectation. Then the other one was, the third one was requiring that INGO staffers, local staffers, after they've been taxed, you pay them a salary, say you pay them $1,000, then they get taxed. Taxation will be at about 30%. So it means you remain with $700. And then they have to contribute another 30% of that $700 to the government. It's double taxation for NGO staffers, plus a few other things. But we've not had, the US come out strongly, to condemn that. We're not hearing people talk about it. So honestly, the voice of the US is lacking out there. We do hope that maybe reason will prevail at some point, and we can see some serious comments and interventions. And I think speaking about it, even if it didn't work out, but just highlighting it, I think is very important. But again, Burundi being what it is, very tiny country in Central Africa that lacks any, is of no strategic importance, maybe through the US, nobody's gonna say anything. Nobody's gonna say anything about it. And I think we need to speak together and support that country.
Benil, do you have a...
I just wanted to talk or sort of ask a question with regards to drawing two things together, the religious leaders, but also influences from the US. Particularly with the religions, a lot of the religion that we practice in most African countries are sort of their imports. But also how religious leaders are part and parcel of what is going on in the US today and how they're influencing narratives in our countries, particularly around elections. So that marginalizing narrative of the other, on the religious basis, but also on cultural basis and like gender orientation, and most conversations that it was never politicized, but is now becoming politicized because it is politicized here in the US, and it's influencing the conversations that people are having because everyone taps into social media, the youth in particular, tap into social media and are seeing these things, seeing migration as an issue. In the past, it was, people from other countries are in your country, but it was never like build a wall or they are coming to take your jobs. We never used such sentiments. Maybe there was like space, obviously resources are very limited, so there was also some tensions in that space, but it was never elevated to a daily conversation of this is how you attack people on like hate online, in person, in schools. It wasn't, so there's also that narrative of what are the religious leaders in our countries or with, or how are we working with religious leaders to make sure that we're not adopting, even though it's the same message or it's the same faith, we're not adopting the human aspect of it, that human greed and that human hatred and that human ability or that human tendency to be afraid of the other. How we're not adopting that in our space because we know what it is like to be on the other side. And we've, in most cases, lived in some semblance of harmony with the different religions. But now we're looking at other spaces and seeing how religion is now being, like with the Muslim ban, and a patronage of poetry, so many things coming from this side of the angle that is now influencing narrative, not even on the political level, but really the grassroots, the youth, the people who are then forming factions and trying to support different political parties and making it, rather than just political ideologies, but now religious ideologies, cultural ideologies, and putting lines in that way.
Let me try to attempt. Maybe I didn't get your question very clearly. Was it a comment or a question? Okay. All right. Pauline, give it a shot.
Yeah. Let me try. Yeah. AFSC and other religious leaders. You know, as AFSC, we try as much as possible to work with other religious organizations, and we do not even differentiate whether it's a Muslim, whether it's, and that is what we would want to see, because as AFSC, you know, we view people, you know, there's that of God in every one of us. So from that belief, we work with all the religious organizations. And I might say that in Africa, I cannot really say in some places that it is so them versus us. They try as much as possible. If you hear there is something that is true, they are saying it's only Muslims doing that, the religious leaders try to come together and say, hey, we have to address this because we do not want to see, you know, that demarcation of Muslims versus, you know, Christians, something like that. So unless Kennedy want to add?
No, I'll just add, that's a very good question, by the way, and I'll just add that one of the contexts where we work is in Somalia, and this is a very highly patriarchal society. And I just wanted to say that in a country like Somalia, of course, Somalia, maybe religion might not be a big issue because almost 99% of the population is Muslim. However, the role of the elders in society is very critical, sometimes at the exclusion of women and youth. And so we really need to see how best really we can work with both the youth and the women, just to ensure that they're mainstreamed within the decision-making processes, but also included within the leadership processes within that country. And that's a lot of it that we are doing. It's a lot of advocacy work and just trying to look for safe spaces, for the youth, safe spaces for women, to be able to discuss the issues and also try to advocate, for those specific issues. Now, for religion, and that can be a very emotive issue, and there is a lot of respect for religion, I think, generally on the continent. And what I'm seeing a lot happening is that most countries right now, you have the umbrella religious bodies that would issue maybe statements on behalf of all the others. Sometimes there are issues, because, people sometimes are compromised in one way or the other. But we've seen, like in Kenya, there's something called the Interreligious Council of Kenya, which includes, the Hindus, the Christians, the Muslims, and all that. And I think under that kind of umbrella, it is much more easier to try and engage in a more objective manner. And so I think the role for organizations like AFSC that are faith-based really is to try to see how best to support in terms of ensuring that that constitution, works and is able to engage, with the system without being biased in one way or the other. I think that would be the approach. But for me, the most critical thing also is ensuring an approach that is all-inclusive. I think that's the only way that we are able to address things in a way that works. Thank you.
Time has flown, and lunch awaits you. So I want to very much thank our panel, Dr. Kamal, Mr. Eccolo, and this room of great expertise for participating in conversation. I feel like we just scratched the surface, but maybe more conversations to come over the coming months, and I hope some further conversation can happen among folks in this room. Our presenters are handing out copies of the report they've done if you're interested, or I think there's also a single sheet if you don't want the weight of a full report. It will give you the link online. So thank you very much.